Bomma le botate, molokoloko wa dirutegi o tla tsena mo nakwaneng ye kopana. Le kgopelwa go ema.
Dames en here, die akademiese prosesie sal nou inbeweeg. U word versoek om asseblief op te staan.
Ladies and gentlemen, the academic procession will now enter. You are kindly requested to stand.
By the power vested in me, I hereby constitute this assembly as a legal congregation of the University of Pretoria. During this assembly, degrees with all the associated rights and privileges will be conferred to the candidates whose names appear in the program. Please take your seats. Ladies and gentlemen, we request you to join us in silent prayer or meditation to give thanks for the achievements of our students. Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, as
individuals undergoing weight loss surgery. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Petrus Albertus Breitenbach, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Creative Writing, with a creative work titled Root and Bone, and a thesis titled The History Writer's Tale, Historical Fiction and the Depiction of Identity in Michiel Haynes's The Typewriter's Tale and Bodies Politic, prepared under my supervision. In his thesis, the candidate investigated the relationship between historical fiction, history, and the portrayal of the identity and characters of historical figures, with specific reference to 2 novels by the South African novelist Michiel Haynes. The distinctions and boundaries between the genres were explored, as well as the unique contribution that historical fiction can make to the popular understanding of the past. The theoretical framework drew on Paul Ricoeur's ideas about narrative and Hayden White's theories regarding the inseparability of history writing from literary tropes. The creative component of the study is a screenplay for an historical fiction mini-series which explores similar themes. Partially set during the 1914 Afrikaner Rebellion, it portrays the identities and characters of several historical personae and explores the complexity of the relationship between past and present. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Mr. Gideon Samalani Chitanga, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science with a thesis entitled The Role of the Southern African Development Community in the Mediation of Interstate Democratization Conflict in Zimbabwe. In his thesis, the candidate examines the role, processes, and outcomes of the SADC mediation between 2007 and 2013 in the context of Pan-African regional diplomacy, which he proposes. The candidate argued that this form of diplomacy centered on regional mediation, dialogue, and negotiations, and it helped to shift the intractable conflict towards a peaceful democratic path anchored on political and constitutional reforms and economic stabilization. The candidate shows how the approach this approach to mediation and post-mediation support to the government of national unity in Zimbabwe reflected the regional self-reliance and enhanced intra-SADC coordination while improving cooperation among parties to the crisis in Zimbabwe. This study contrasts this particular approach with a Western coercive form of diplomacy that deepened conflict and worsened the crisis before then. During the GNU, the candidate shows that this approach, Pan-African regional diplomacy, helped Zimbabwe experience the most stable regime since 1980, and which he considers to be a basis for building a stable future in Zimbabwe. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Ruth Mary Kutzer, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Psychology with a thesis titled The Impact of Blue, Green and Urban Spaces on Acute Stress Levels in an Adult Population, a Psychological Perspective, prepared under the supervision of Professor Nicoline Coetzee and under my co-supervision. In her thesis, the candidate explores the extent to which natural scenes assist in the recovery of acute stress. The candidate conducted an experiment where participants were exposed to a stressor followed by viewing one of 3 nature scene videos. Stress and restoration were measured psychophysiologically. Employing the evolutionary psychological approach of stress reduction theory, results showed that blue spaces, which are areas dominated by views of water, were most effective in reducing acute stress, followed by green spaces. Urban spaces increased stress levels. This novel finding suggests that not only should natural areas be preserved, but spending time in nature is an effective method of reducing acute stress. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce you to Oko Chima Enworo, who has complied with the requirements of the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Sociology with a thesis titled Beyond Periphery, Dynamics of Indigenous Social Protection Systems in Dealing with Covariate Shocks in Southeastern Nigeria, prepared under my supervision. In this thesis, the candidate explored the patterns and functions of indigenous social protection systems in Nigeria and their potential to mitigate the risk and impact of covariate shocks, using flooding as an example. Using a qualitative evidence and the social risk management framework, the candidate illustrates how these systems effectively manage threats and mitigate the risk and adverse effects of covariate shocks through material and psychosocial attributes. The results justify plausible models for linking formal and indigenous social protection systems for broader coverage and human development in resource-constrained contexts. The candidate provides strategic policy and practice recommendations for achieving this. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Nicola Lee Haskins, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Decolonial Storying, Embodied Memory in Facilitating Choreographic Composition. It was prepared under my supervision and with Professor Mart Munro as co-supervisor. In this study, the candidate designed and qualitatively reflected on the perceived efficacy of decolonial teaching and learning strategies to facilitate movement creation for choreographic composition in a dance program at a higher education institute in South Africa. These strategies drew on the research methodology of embodied inquiry and used decolonial storying as method to access autobiographical embodied memories in creating solo and group choreographic works. The candidate argued that teaching and learning strategies that access autobiographical and specifically embodied memories engage students' identities, lived experiences, sociocultural contexts, and ontological positions in an interwoven way in creative processes. Her findings demonstrate that such strategies can contribute to shifting the historical locus of enunciation in choreographic compositional curricula in South Africa and decolonizing such curricula. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Edwin Hlase, who has complied with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations with a thesis titled The African Union-China Strategic Partnership, Prospects and Challenges of Aligning Africa's Agenda 2063 with China's Vision 2049. Under my supervision. In the thesis, the candidate used Wilkins' strategic partnership model to analyze the Africa-China strategic partnership. The study examined how the African Union Agenda 2063 and China's Vision 2049 are aligned, focusing on how engagements affect the partners' respective economic, political, and social aspirations. The empirical evidence shows that the African Union and China succeeded in using their partnership to pursue their respective development, security, and geopolitical goals. However, the partnership perpetuates Africa's dependence on external actors, encourages divisions among African Union member states, and compounds the challenges of addressing Africa's governance and peace and security issues. The study recommends a clear alignment of the national interest of China and African countries with the African Union's collective goals and creating an effective institutional framework for the African Union and its member states to follow up on the strategic partnership agreements. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Dimpo Kokome, who has complied with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in International Relations with a thesis titled Borders and Identity, Identity Construction Among the Xhosa Speaking People of South Africa and Lesotho at Telebridge, conducted or prepared under my supervision. In the thesis, the candidate critically examined the identity formation of the Xhosa speaking people at the Telebridge border between South Africa and Lesotho. The empirical evidence demonstrates how Telebridge communities do not experience the anticipated identity crisis often related to border communities. The study finds that shared culture and language transformed the border from a separating device to a place of convergence, strengthening relations and encouraging the preservation of a shared culture. The study further finds that the Xhosa language significantly influences identity formation and cross-border relations. Xhosa communities cross the borders as dictated by convenience, irrespective of the laws and regulations put in place. Based on these realities, the study recommends easing border crossings and establishing legal movement channels to facilitate safe and legal crossing between the above communities. Mr. Vice Principals, I request that you confer the degree to the candidate. Well done.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Tafirenika Madziyozwa, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in English, with a thesis titled Landscapes of Violence, Galleries of Crime, Gender Violence in Selected Post-Apartheid Crime Novels Written by Women, prepared under my supervision and with my colleague, Dr. Colette Guldiman, who provided invaluable expertise and guidance as co-supervisor. In this thesis, the candidate interrogated the depiction of gender violence in selected South African post-apartheid crime novels written by women. The study contends that these female writers subvert both the generic traditions of crime fiction and the position women tend to occupy in situations of gender violence, particularly in the context of the ubiquity of gender violence in post-apartheid South Africa. These female writers create female characters who engage various strategies to resist, cope with, and respond to gender violence. To frame this thesis conceptually, the candidate employed Judith Butler's theory of performativity and the notion of corporeal feminism to analyze how the female characters contest the normative womanhood that places them in positions of victimhood, at times even using what might be considered to be unethical means to deal with gender violence. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Saro Mare, who has complied with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis entitled Mobile Terms in the Conceptual Architecture of Michel Foucault's Productive Power, prepared under my supervision with Professor Susan van Zyl as co-supervisor. In his thesis, the candidate investigates changes in some operative terms in Foucault's work, namely production, population, prediction, the norm, and the subject. The candidate traces the conceptual transformations in these terms and correlates them with shifts in power-knowledge configurations. Power-knowledge refers to the dynamic relations between the exercise of power and the knowledges informing and underpinning it. The thesis provides new understandings of the moves within and between power-knowledge configurations in Foucault's work. The method of analysis allows for a novel reading of the history of power and governance in Foucault's work. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Robert Ndanduleni Maungedzo, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in English with a thesis titled Tuma Mina, Debates about South African Literature in English and Implications for High School Curricula, prepared under my supervision and with my colleague Dr. Idette Nume as co-supervisor. The crucial part played by Dr. Nume in the supervision of the study cannot be overestimated. The candidate and I are both deeply grateful to her for her guidance. In this thesis, the candidate investigated the complexities involved in defining South African literature in English, a notoriously elusive and slippery concept. He suggests a new way of conceptualizing South African literature in English in the post-apartheid era by fusing theoretical debates by scholars and academics on the topic with the practice and experience of teaching and learning this literature at the further education and training grades 10 to 12 level by subject advisors, educators, and learners. This gave the study a very practical dimension. Particular emphasis was placed on the prescribed literature for grades 10 to 12. Curriculum and assessment policy statements and other policy documents were analyzed to see whether there are discrepancies between policy and what educational practitioners do in practice. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Ndumise Ngube, who has complied with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in English with a thesis entitled Border Thinking as Literary Imaginations, Rereading Decolonial Entanglements in Fiction by Bessie Head, Tsitsi Dangarengwa, and Kopano Matla, prepared under the supervision of my colleague, Dr. Fasselt. In his thesis, the candidate draws on contemporary decolonial debates and feminist border theories to read selected works by Southern African women writers. Examining the ways in which the novels recalibrate theoretical ideas from other Global South contexts, the thesis demonstrates that a departure from earlier African feminist readings of the three novels allows for the introduction of a new decolonial reading paradigm born out of the specificities of the Southern African experience. The study finds that the exploitation of women as portrayed in these texts can be understood as part of the coloniality of gender and argues that the novel's various aesthetic strategies mobilize other cosmologies of being as a way of challenging the colonial imposition of the gender binary and in pursuit of pluriversal modes of thinking. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Zainab Monisola Olaitan, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Political Science, with a thesis titled Gender Quotas and the Substantive Representation of Women in African Politics, Case Studies of Botswana and South Africa, prepared under the supervision of my colleague, Professor Christopher Isike. In this thesis, the candidate examined the relevance of gender quotas to discover how they enable the substantive representation of women in politics. Using the cases of South Africa and Botswana, the thesis combined the interpretative phenomenology and thematic analyses to evaluate how the presence of women in Parliament influences legislative and policy outcomes on gender-based violence and femicide. This was further foregrounded in the politics of presence and relational feminism and theoretical frameworks to explain how women's presence in politics creates impact. Aside from its gender mainstreaming value, which has contrasting nuances in South Africa and Botswana, the findings show that gender quotas are always useful pathways for ensuring quality political representation of women in Africa. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Marinda Robenheimer, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Speech-Language Pathology with a thesis titled Sensory-Based Interventions to Enhance Communication Intervention in Pre-Verbal Children with Autism Spectrum Disorder, prepared under my supervision and with Professor Mia Leroux as a co-supervisor. In this thesis, the candidate critically evaluated the implementation of sensory-based interventions by speech-language therapists and its effect on the communication of children with autism spectrum disorder. It was substantiated that speech-language therapists have a role in the implementation of sensory-based interventions and that such interventions may positively influence the frequency of spontaneous communication and responsiveness of these children. The candidate emphasizes the need for specialized training opportunities for speech-language therapists and interdisciplinary collaboration with occupational therapists in implementing sensory-based interventions and appeals for further research into the efficacy of such practices. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce you to Marilyn Saunders, who complied with the requirements of the degree Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled Group Work with Married Couples, a marriage skill intervention program to improve the competencies of couples, prepared under my supervision. In this thesis, the candidate embarked on a comprehensive study using action research, focusing on developing and implementing and evaluating an evidence-based psychoeducational intervention, providing skills to enhance the relationship of married couples, especially for a low-income community unable to afford psychological services. The motivation of the study was the lack of relationship training for couples, increased divorce statistics, and research results showing that relationship skills can improve marital satisfaction. An 18-hour intervention based on the marital systems theory was presented to 14 multicultural couples. The results from the mixed methods evaluation show that marital satisfaction, communication, conflict management improved significantly, and that couples developed closeness and hope to improve their marriage. The intervention shows promise in improving marital skills of couples in a multicultural, low-resourced context. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce you to Doreen Baruch Cicero, who has complied with the requirements for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy with a thesis titled An Evaluation of Biotechnological Enhancement in the Light of an African Perspective of Personhood, the Metaphysical Aspects of Botu and Human Nature. Under my supervision. What are called biotechnological enhancements are interventions designed to improve individual human capabilities, such as health and intelligence, to levels far surpassing the norm. In this thesis, the candidate novelly considered the extent to which such enhancements are compatible with Botu, an indigenous philosophy prominent in Botswana, and especially with its metaphysical views about human nature, personal identity, and free will. After providing reasons to use Botu as a philosophical framework and providing an interpretation of it informed by scholarly sources and the candidate's own familiarity, the thesis considered whether enhancements would undermine conditions such as humanness, identity, and freedom. The thesis concludes that some enhancements would be consistent with Botu's account of these conditions, while others would not, and provided specifications of each. Mr. Vice Principal, I hereby request you to confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Fiona Taylor, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Creative Writing with a creative work titled Truth and a thesis titled The Master of the Unsayable, an examination of Elena Ferrante's unique methods of exploring truth in her fiction, prepared under my supervision. In her thesis, the candidate analyzed Elena Ferrante's use of realism as an authorial technique and what truth means and has the potential to mean in a work of fiction via the investigation of two of Ferrante's novels, namely My Brilliant Friend, published in 2016, and The Lying Life of Adults, published in 2020. Ferrante's apparent ability to write the unsayable in a masterfully believable way is examined through her employment of recognizably realist techniques and how she uses her unique style to go further than other realist writers to achieve this perceived mastery. The candidate's remarkably rich and evocative novel, Truth, which constitutes the creative component of this PhD, depicts the lives of three women in post-independent Zimbabwe, and then some years later in the broader world, exploring the idea of truth with particular reference to its relationship to racism, friendship, and upbringing. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, may I introduce to you Dominic Marie Verkerk, who has complied with all requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in History under my supervision with a thesis titled The South African War and Afrikaner Nationalism in Afrikaans Language Films and Television, Changing Representation circa the 1930s to 2000. In her thesis, the candidate critically evaluates select Afrikaans language films and television series produced and released during the 1930s to the 2000s, which focused on the South African War of 1899 to 1902. The films and television series are analyzed as primary sources for understanding changing representations of Afrikaner nationalism during this period. The visual sources are framed and analyzed as sites of memory. As such, they function as filmic memorials of specific historical moments and personalities. As filmic memorials, these visual sources have played an important role in nurturing and sustaining Afrikaner identity and ethno-nationalism, in which war has been framed as a liberatory war for the very survival of the Afrikaner nation. These films and television series recall and commemorate a traumatic past in service of a specific ethno-nationalist and political agenda using a range of narrative devices and tropes. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you to confer the doctoral degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Rajan Vermeulen, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Speech-Language Pathology with a thesis titled Understanding and Improving Vocal Health, a tiered investigation into vocal hygiene, demands, perceptions, and voice use reduction in occupational voice users, prepared under my supervision and with Dr. Maria de Toy as co-supervisor. In the thesis, the candidate explored the current evidence regarding vocal health and knowledge among occupational voice users. She further described the voice profile of South African occupational voice users requiring voice rehabilitation and the evidence behind using vocal hygiene education in practice. Based on these findings, the candidate evaluated the effect of the novel voice use reduction program on voice quality and vocal fatigue in occupational voice users. The findings encourage using a combination of direct voice therapy and vocal hygiene education, including the voice use reduction program, helping to develop healthier voice use, foster patient autonomy, facilitate vocal hygiene healing, and prevent further and future injury to occupational voice users' voices. These findings promote vocal hygiene consciousness and awareness for preventative voice care initiatives in the unique population through using vocal hygiene education and voice use reduction globally. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Galus Atabongwong, who has complied with the requirement for the degree of Doctor of Philosophy in Anthropology with a thesis titled The Experience of Xenophobia Among Informal Immigrant Entrepreneurs, the Case of Francophone African Immigrants in Pretoria, prepared under my supervision. In the thesis, the candidate examined the different ways in which Francophone African informal immigrant entrepreneurs are discriminated against while conducting their business, the type of harassment they experience, the perpetrators of the xenophobic attacks against them, and why they are attacked. The empirical evidence demonstrates how avoiding the informal immigrant entrepreneurs to buy from local informal traders is an experience of discrimination. It shows that Francophone African immigrant entrepreneurs are desensitized to harassment because they are overexposed to it, and finds that high school boys and political affiliates are among the perpetrators of xenophobic attacks. It also reveals that the traders are attacked because of the failure to lend money to South Africans. The thesis recommends school education and awareness campaigns to address this discrimination, and that political parties should train their members to combat xenophobia. Mr. Vice Principal, I request that you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, I introduce to you Ashela Musindo, who has complied with the requirements for the degree Doctor of Philosophy in Development Studies with a thesis titled Women and Climate Change-Induced Water Management Strategies in Zimbabwe, prepared under my supervision. In this thesis, the candidate used vulnerability approaches and sustainable livelihood frameworks to examine the multifarious effects of climate change on women and the water management strategies used to adapt to its effects. The thesis argues that although climate change affects all women, The impact varies according to circumstances or relevant factors. The circumstances or factors include age, marital status, education, social status, and disability. This study contributes to an improved understanding of how the diverse effects of climate change impact on women. In addition, insights into water management from this study provide an impetus for development practitioners to consider proactive adaptation strategies that enable continued rural livelihood sustainability. Mr. Vice Principal, I request you confer the degree on the candidate.
I hereby confer the degree Doctor of Philosophy with all its associated rights and privileges on the candidate. Congratulations.
Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Arts, African Languages. Bernard Boyer with distinction. In Applied Language Studies, Melissa Roost, and she receives the Applied Language Studies Award. In audiology, Divan Duplessis receives the Master of Arts in Audiology Award with distinction. Lauren Fredericks, Master of Arts in Audiology with an award. In clinical psychology, Hotaso Mokitle with an award in clinical psychology. Joshua Yitman with distinction. Nolutando Javu, Counseling Psychology Award. Corinne Rath with distinction. In diplomatic studies, Vumile Ludlu. In English, Joanine Muller. In Fine Arts, Claudia Brown. Clinton Furey. In psychology, Sasabona Maseko. In research psychology, Tanya Benadi. Elizabeth Msimango. Emmanuel Ndimani. In speech language pathology, Karen Change. Simone Duplessis. Dominique Henning. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Drama. Francois Hasbrook. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Arts in History of Art, Digital Culture and Media. Timothy Gawaya, with distinction. Riley Renga, with distinction. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Music, Music Technology. Avuilwe Ngaweni. In Music Therapy, Nadia Smith. In Performing Art, Chloe Botha, with distinction. Yolandi Sharp, with distinction. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Social Work. Comelia Foster, with distinction. Then in Social Development Theory, Nomzamo Dukada. Hahiso Mojela. Awelani Mudira. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Social Work in Play Therapy, Play-Based Intervention. Evande Furi. Oriel Strachem. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Social Science in Development Studies. Mufaro Mpofu. In Gender Studies, Tandwa Dlamini. In Sociology, Motsohwamo Ngoli. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Master of Social Science in Heritage and Cultural Sciences Heritage Conservation. Nkami Manyike. In History, Michael van Ingenhal. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Arts Honors in International Relations. Melissa Pinar. In Political Science, Lerato Lova. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Social Science Honors, Industrial Sociology and Labor Studies. Hiamotse Mate. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Arts. Tristan Ashton. Luzan Daika. Shreya Gangaram. Jaco Janse van Rensburg. Nompumelelo Luvuno. Nelisiwe Madinane. Edgar Maloho. Tristan Monzeglio. Samkelo Shabangu. In languages, Peño Mateke. In law, Fariam Kamin. Dineo Diradicile. Sabiha Lunat. Yoliswa Ngwenya. In visual studies, Petra Pepla. Zondo Olwetu Andiswa. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Drama. Dylan Dos Santos. Dante Elliot Duplessis. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Political Science, International Studies. Convenant Mohlahla. Nompumelelo Sibande. Reagan Van Aert. In political sciences, Mangalimeng Lehoho. Mr. Vice Principal, the following candidates have complied with all the requirements for the degree Bachelor of Social Science in Heritage and Cultural Sciences, Heritage and Cultural Tourism. Mtokozizi Matlingosi. Esona Mazoloana.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us give our graduates a big hand for their hard work and perseverance. Thank you. Now I would like to ask our graduates to applaud their families, friends, and partners for their support over the years. Thank you. We have now come to the end of the proceedings. I wish to invite you all present for refreshments afterwards in front of the aula. You are requested to stand for the singing of the national anthem and to remain standing until the assembly has been dissolved and the academic procession has left the auditorium. The words of the national anthem are printed on the inside back cover of the program. I request you to please rise. By the powers vested in me, I hereby dissolve the Assembly of the University of Pretoria.